My first comments on the election would be I wouldn't read too much into what's going on because at this time in the cycle, the first year after a new administration comes in and you have a change like you have, it's typical that the midterms would be a loss, if not oftentimes a shellacking. And we're not sure that we're going to get there yet, but there were some interesting takeaways from last week, and I have some Gallup surveys that I've pulled together on what their takeaways were from it. So this is more them than me. But some key messages from the Virginia, New Jersey, and other elections, Minnesota, upstate New York, and other areas. But some of the factors just to take a look at. President Biden's approval rating was the second lowest at this point since World War II. The only one lower was President Trump. Bill Clinton was slightly higher, but the bigger issue isn't the actual level of the rating, but the trending of the rating down has come down quite a bit, pretty fast. The other thing out of New Jersey and even nationally, for all the talk about the social agenda, a lot of the voters, the number one issue was the economy. And that was a third of the voters in Virginia, big number nationally. New Jersey, it was taxes is a big issue. And as a SALT tax state, that's one. But the taxes and what happened when Trump took away the SALT deduction, Trump administration did. Now it's being debated how it gets put back in and how. So that clearly became a big issue. Newer concerns from the Gallup surveys that they hadn't heard in a while were concerns about inflation and deficits getting the highest numbers they've had since 08 and 16. What I thought was really interesting is a big part of the polling was what's the appropriate role for government? And this became a bigger issue. And overall, Americans prefer a more limited than active role, less regulation rather than more. And most think government's too powerful. And for me, one of the big surprises was out of the surveys was that they asked what's the biggest problem for the country, and many people said it was government. I do think the education issue is a big issue, and I think it might have been the undoing of McAuliffe, and he had in the debate, he made this statement that he doesn't think parents should be telling schools what they should teach. The Hill, which is a political publication, said it was deserving of a top listing in the Hall of Fame political blunders. And it turns out that because of the way the pandemic had different school and education, and should kids stay out, go in, how they're dealing with that, and that became a bigger issue. And I think it's going to be an issue that stays with us for a while. And I think whether it's government or business leaders or any kind of leaders, I think your behavior during the pandemic period will define your organization or your party or your affiliation for a long time to come. And I think what you're seeing in some of the results and some of the messages coming back are a lack of confidence in the way leadership has handled these things. So we'll come back to that. State of play is really, these policy disagreements that have stalled the passage of key agenda items is a big problem. And people with the election, they wanted the politicians to back up the talk and lead by example. And I think there's some concerns about how that's being put forward. Second thing is the Democratic Party is actually a lot more varied in their political beliefs than the Republican Party, which is part of what the challenge is of pushing their agenda forward right now, but it's also potentially an opportunity down the road. They generally agree on spending programs, but not how to pay for them. We'll get into that a little bit more, but they tend to agree on the issues themselves. So that's an interesting take. So one of the things that Gallup came up with in their survey was they asked people to describe their political views, very conservative, moderate, liberal, or very liberal. And they take the very conservative and the liberal and very liberal and kind of mash them together. But what you see is the Republicans are very consistent with, predominantly conservative and then some moderate and very few liberals. The Democrats tend to skew very liberal, but big numbers on moderate, and even 3 times the percentage of conservatives that the Republicans have for liberals. So it is a pretty interesting group. What I find also fascinating is how the independents are so evenly spread across the three areas. But then you get into inside the Democratic Party, you've seen shifts in over the last 20 years of it becoming more liberal, moderates becoming a little less moderate, and the conservatives percentage becoming a lot less conservative. And I think a lot of that has come in large part with the wars going on. And if you look back in 2001, you saw a little bit of a tick up in the conservatives in the Democratic Party. And then as the war dragged on, you saw that continue to decline. And then you fast forward to some of the issues we've had over the last several years and the inequality issues growing. And I think that's a big part of what's shifted the power from the moderates to the liberals. Be interesting to see how that stays. But they're increasingly divided on economic issues. And this is actually, I think, one of the more fascinating elements that's at play right now in Washington is the views of, Senator Joe Manchin and others, and why they're sticking to their moderate line. And on economic issues, the moderates have held pretty steady for the last 20 years. The conservatives have seen a decline, and clearly the liberals have moved up. But I think when it comes to real action, I think it becomes a bigger issue, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And this is why, because the parties agree to disagree on the role of government. We've known that for a long time, but when you see the numbers, it's actually pretty fascinating. The Democrats believe government's should do more, but only 18% saying it's doing too much, where the Republicans are almost a mirror image on the opposite way, and the independents are pretty split as well. And I think this issue is going to have a bigger role in where we go going forward and how the next election. And when you get to this preference of do we want more services? Yes, but how do we want to pay for them? And when you go party by party, they prefer more services with more taxes on the Democrats, 37%. But when you go to prefer less services to reduce taxes, those are big numbers from the independents and the Republicans, not a big surprise, or keep services as they are now. I think this is going to be a really interesting area, and part of the challenge for the Democratic agenda right now, and an important element for where their messaging is going forward for the midterms, and how do they avoid a real big loss in the midterm elections when they're expected to lose some already. It's going to be interesting to see play out as well. The views on social issues have been pretty consistent. They have skewed more liberal as things have evolved over the last several years, but I think you're looking at an issue where they've been pretty consistent on the social side, but it really is how do you pay for the program. So I think the takeaways are the current behavior in DC is not confidence inspiring at all. Taxes are a big issue, and only 37% favor higher taxes for more services, which I think is going to be a big problem. And I don't think where Senator Manchin and some of the other moderates are holding out is out of step as much as maybe the press is making it out to be. I think the pay-fors are going to be a bigger issue, and I don't think taxes are going to be the answer alone. And I think getting that balance right, I don't think the message is resonating where you can just soak the rich, because I don't think people feel like it's just going to be the rich that gets soaked. So I think that's an important point. For the Democrats, though, their diversity of views can actually be a strength as they shift, because it's easier to shift from liberal to more moderate inside the party. And I think that's part of what's maybe hurting President Biden's approval ratings, is he was strong in standing tall for a more moderate agenda during the primaries. And after he was, and through his election, and after he was elected, there's some concerns that he's might be leaning too far to bring the progressives along. And I think that's going to be one of the issues that they have to figure out, is where do they want to end up to get what they want done. But I don't think the Democrats are alone in having a problem with their messaging. The Republicans have been able to stand back, but there is a question that's coming for them, which is from the Virginia election, how did the Republican winner for governor, how did he step away a little bit from the Trump issues and not identify himself as a Trump Republican and more of a new type of Republican where he's focused on the issues and not on the drama and the media and all that and the branding? He's really focused on the issues that matter. And I think the issues that matter are going to be taxes, education, and the services that people are getting, and also just the behavior that these people are exhibiting as leaders. I think the optimal role of government is going to be a really big issue in the coming years, and how people thread the needle there is going to be very important. But this one survey question that keeps coming up on a monthly basis from Gallup is the biggest problem in our country. Poor leadership, number one, and number two is government. So I think both parties have some challenges. So I'm going to stop here and open it up for people to go. I see we have a lot of comments in this area. Not trying to be controversial at all. I don't think either party's actually nailed this one. I think there's some real issues going forward that both parties are going to have to try and thread the needle on. And it's going to be very important to see how well the money that's put out gets spent, because people don't want to higher taxes and overall for either one. So I think we're going to have some really interesting things coming up here. And the messaging from each parties, I think, is going to be fascinating how that has to change. So I'll stop there and open it up for comments from the group.
Stephen, is there any statistics information as the age groups for Republicans, Independents, Democrats, and how those leanings?
I didn't get. They didn't take it down to that level from what I could find.
Okay.
Tom, you're a branding guy and a messaging guy going way back. What's your take?
I think you're so right. I mean, if you think about their ability to message, Trump, that was really one of his strengths. I mean, he knew how to take issues and create little short, pithy expressions and he just over and over again express them. Whether it's, make America great again, stop the steal. He took some of the Democrats' own messaging and turned it on them, right? Defund the police. Yep. And I think the Republicans, they're really aligned at that. They tend to, like it or not, once Trump kind of got on his platform, they would carry his message forward with pretty good alignment, consistency. I think to your other point, the Democrats, on one hand, their greatest strength is their diverse nature. It's also their greatest weakness, because they can't get aligned on the messaging, and thus they also can't get aligned on how to make decisions because of the unique diversity of that party. And until they figure out how to deliver messages in a clear, concise, and consistent way, I just don't think they can carry the day through the midterms.
Yeah, I think it's a real struggle with the emergence of the popularity of the progressive groups, how they fit in and how you affect policy with that divergence of views is really hard. And I think that's what we're seeing. And I think part of the challenge for both parties is the lack of confidence in government right now, I think, is pretty high. And if you don't start delivering in a way that people are more comfortable that they can trust leadership, I think we're going to I think both parties will have a problem until they can get position there. But it's going to be fascinating to see how they re-message going into the midterms.
Focus can be a really, really powerful driver, right? Yep. Business focus of message, people, they can rally around it. And if you stay focused over time, begin to understand what you're trying to do. And it's just hard to get that, particularly from the Democratic Party.
Yep.
Hey, okay. Stephen, what are the chances that they get nothing done with this bill? I mean, I look at the numbers you put on the screen there, yep, and it just seems to me, if I knew nothing else other than the numbers, it looks like there's about 37% of the population that would support something, or it was 37% of Democrats. They don't even have a consensus for taxing and spending. And I'm not making a statement about the qualitative value of these. I'm just looking at your numbers. I don't see where a consensus comes out of that.
I think that's a great
for
point.
Anything.
the question is, I think the issue is politicians tend to be very reactive. So that what are they going to do now that they just got this, these last election results come in? Are they going to act on it or ignore it, or how do they adjust? Because I think that is part of the problem, that right now they're worried that if you're Joe Manchin and you look what happened, you're probably pretty empowered by the results of last week. On the other hand, we know that the squad is actually doubling down, saying that this means we need to be stronger in our messaging and more aggressive, and we need to be more unified. Which actually, is that going to make them more divided? I don't know the answer to that, but the Democratic leaders are going to have having a real issue. They've had it for some time, and the question is, who's running the party right now? And I think there's some questions on that there's a real tug of war for control of the messaging and of the agenda. So we're going to have to see on that one, Duncan, but it hasn't been easy, so it won't likely be easy from here.
Well, it sounds like Joe Manchin, but I mean, what's going to happen? The House is going to pass something, right? And that's going to go to the Senate, and the Senate's going to tear it to shreds. And the question is, do they tear it to shreds so much that the whole thing completely dies, or do they pass like less than $1 trillion of something?
Yeah, and I think the issue isn't the dollar amount, but I think the bigger issue is, if you're trying to do all the things instead of prioritizing what's most important, or what are the couple most important ones, that it's hard to keep everyone enthusiastic about it, because they're not going to feel like the benefits are going to come to them if everything's too diffused in terms of the impact. So I think that's part of the challenge that they have to really figure out. And it's interesting, because the U.S. isn't alone in this kind of political transitioning that they're trying to figure out where we go from here post-pandemic. You're reading, the Germany, they're having some real issues defining the parties there now as well. And you're seeing a lot of that kind of uncertainty about how to face off in the world and what's the right thing internally and externally for your country. And I think politicians are in a tough spot right now, because there's a lot of problems that they're trying to solve, and you can't solve them all at once. So how do you prioritize them? And I think that's part of the problem with the agenda that's being put forward on the social infrastructure, is there's so many things that we're trying to do all at once. It's going to be hard to feel like you're going to get accomplished. Yeah. So I think it's a problem.
I think you're absolutely right. 3 years from now, people are like, well, nothing changed. It's so diffuse. Unlike Obamacare, right? Healthcare affects everybody, right?
Yep.
What are the one or two things that you want to do and do really, really well that's going to potentially influence and improve the lives of the many? Yep. That plan doesn't do it.
Well, the problem is, if it was your own company, if the country was your company, would you try and do all those things at once? Or would you try and do a couple of them and do them really well, and then move on to the other ones? And if you're making your investments spend where it's highly productive, you'll be able to finance future initiatives off of the success of the current ones, same way you do in business. But we're not doing that. So I think that's part of the challenge. But I just found the numbers fascinating, because I would have thought they were going to say something else to me, that the two parties were kind of mirror images where they aren't. I thought that was going to be the takeaway. The other one that was big, and I'm fascinated by this, is that they view government as the number one problem right now, which is not great if you're an elected official.
Stephen, do they articulate at all as to what that problem is with government?
I think it's not getting stuff done.
Mm-hmm.
And also it is the overall behavior. Like, people don't like our elected officials, our leaders, to be acting in a way that is not, what we'd envision our leaders to be. And I think that's part of the problem. Yeah, sure.
And some of it not COVID related, right? Regardless of where you are on whether there should be restrictions or shouldn't be restrictions, or still or not, putting all of that aside, the messaging has been incomplete. And to the extent that there have been restrictions, sometimes they're hard to explain why. And I don't want to get into a fight about it, but why can you wear your mask here and not there when the other place looks like you're going to be around more people, right? Some of the activities that were restricted didn't make sense, the economic effects of it. So I think that this is one of those circumstances where for every 10 people, there's 11 opinions on it. And I think because of that, everybody feels that the government did something wrong, whether they did do too much or too little. And because there's been some change, some of it natural because science evolves over time, and some of it messaging under both administrations that people are saying, wait a second, you told us this, and it turns out it's that. And add that to the rumor mill and social media, and that just makes everybody not trust somebody for a whole host of different reasons.
I think you're right. And I think the pandemic issue where it really came through is in education, because the views on education that were creating the problems where, when you see in certain areas of the country, kids are going to school and in other areas they're not, and that is restricting the parents' ability to go to work and all that. I do think those restrictions and how that played out definitely played through as a factor there. And I also think just overall, there's a level of what I would say is pandemic exhaustion, that we're reached our limit. And you see that interactions with people all the time, that, we're just tired of the pandemic and people are at wit's end, and it's created a lot of frayed nerves and things like that. And I think that's a reflection of some of the frustrations of the voters as well. So I do think that it tied into education, but I think it's also more of kind of just a hangover from the pandemic and waiting for it to get behind us. But it's fascinating to see how, Gallup does these most of these surveys are either weekly or monthly. So their numbers going back 20 years, you look at the shifts and you can really see how our country's evolved. And you go back to in 2000, we're dealing with, 9/11, then the start of a couple wars, then you have, the financial crisis, and you keep going through up until today. And we've been hit with a lot of stuff over the last 20 years. And then the pandemic might've been just the icing on the cake. But
and Stephen, this might be a whole topic for another day, but polling also presents an interesting issue, right? Because I think in one of the poll answers that you showed, it said, they actually said, do you want more services if it costs more money? But I think there's a nuance to that, right? Because I think if you listen to some of the messaging, it's not going to cost me money, it's going to cost someone else money. But then if you listen, and then whether that's true or not depends on, which station you're watching, right? But the sort of indirect tax on people, whether it's inflation or trickle down or coming out of corporations. And I think that if you say to somebody, do you want this? What generally isn't asked is how much more would you be willing to pay for it? And I think you'd find very different answers on a lot of those questions if you tied in a payment to them personally, and not to just some random person that they consider to be wealthy.
Yeah, I think you're right. But I think one of the challenges with that is the lack of confidence in government actually delivering to them.
Yes.
Is where the problem starts to come. And I think that's why people view government as the biggest problem right now. It goes to Tom's point. If they could get it done and be successful at it in a couple things, you'd have a lot more confidence overall. But Eddie Vanderpart joined, and we spent 2 hours discussing the two-party system of the US versus what they're doing in Europe. And you had some interesting takes on that, Eddie. So you want to just give your European and now US view of that?
It's a long story.
I'm putting you on the spot.
No, there's also been a lot of research about this, but the two-party system oftentimes lead to suboptimal outcomes. If you look at the choices you have in the two-party system, it's almost like what we say in competition on the beach. You either go to one party or to another party, and it's a little bit of a black and white thing, and a lot of issues will be sort of placed in the context of we have something and the opposition has another thing, and there's two flavors. It's black and white or two colored or whatever you say. While if you have a 3 or more party system, it's typically more nuance comes in. The third party can either sort of trade favors with the biggest other party and say, I think this topic is important, and therefore I want this topic to be heard. And I, in order for you to get my vote, or to have an altogether different sort of set, a different, let's say, opinion. And so you have a three different types of things going on. And it turns out that if you think that democracy is most aptly represented by people listening to minority voices instead of majority voices, then a multi-party system is a better outcome than a two-party system in many variations. Needless to say, when you bifurcate voices, which the last sort of, I want to say 10 years at least happened in the United States, then you get sort of, if you look at sort of a political party as a straight line, and you know, these little sort of dots, they move further and further apart. You get much less sort of attractive decision making, because it's either all the way to the left or all the way to the right, which is sort of what's happening right now. And in many instances, that's sort of suboptimal in any way. But even in good times, I think their multi-party systems have typically better outcomes than two-party systems. Real multi-party systems, so real where the third party has, you know, more than just a couple percent, and is a significant voice.
Eddie, which country do you think does the multi-party system best?
There's a number, without naming my own country, because that would be mean. I think a lot of Western and North, without naming sort of names, a lot of Western and Northern European countries have done reasonably well, and with reasonably well, meaning they represent the choices people really want to make.
Other thoughts from the group on this? Because it's one
Yeah, Stephen, along the lines of what Eddie was saying, in looking at the numbers that you had up there, the independents in particular seem to be quite, either they're influential or they're being influenced. And where are they coming from? And if they could be organized over, 30 years, we've had attempts here in the United States to have a third party, and it's never worked out. So my point is that independent group seems to be solidly moderate across the board. And they are the ones that seem to me to be the ones that are going to make the decisions.
Be interesting to say. Richard, you were about to say?
I was just going to say the same thing kind of happens between the major parties that we have now, but I think there's a great disparity between the homogenous nature of parties in Europe and the very non-homogeneous nature of the United States and developing markets like Africa. So when you have a multi-party system in those countries, including, I think, the United States, there's a high possibility that you'll have a very estranged group in this issuance, a group that's either very far right or very far left, running most of the country. If you have a 25% voter group that gets together, and some of those could come from that independent group. But when you have so many people from so many different backgrounds with so many different geographies involved, levels of income involved, and what have you, and I see the same thing in multi-party systems in sub-Saharan Africa, and it's difficult. It's very difficult because it goes from one extreme party to another extreme party to another, and they're not necessarily extreme, but they have a singular focus for one or two things, and then the rest of it, they really don't know what they're doing typically, which is the problem. So they may have a goal to help farmers, which is great, but then they know nothing about infrastructure, and then they approve or spend or don't spend, and you end up letting the rest of the country go to hell in a handbasket while they're focused for 4 or 5 years on the on that special set of concerns that they had. So I'm an independent, so I tell people where I sit before I tell them where I stand. And I think that it's good to have that group of people that are not sitting on either side to help sway the movement from one direction to the other, to hopefully keep people, in the case of the United States, to keep the United States from becoming a communist country, and to keep the United States from becoming a overly simplistic US only, and keeping a global mindset. Those kinds of things help. I think that middle party helps, but I think that there's a value in them being up for bid. I think that those other parties, knowing that they have to win them, helps bring them to the middle, where if they were a third party, they would all be inimical. But having them as a prize that they can move from one way to the other by finding out what are the things that move the middle, I think that actually helps strengthen those other parties. But that's that, and $5 will get you a Starbucks.
Appreciate the views. It's a tough topic because there's we don't know what the right answer is, certainly for here, but we know what's going right now is not really what's satisfying people. I think that's the safe thing, and you can see that in every time we have an election, the swings keep going back and forth. So getting their messaging right, I think, is Tom, with all the money that this is spent, you'd think they would get their messaging a lot better.
Although, I mean, you could argue, though, that the founding fathers created a structure that encouraged this, right? The balance of power across 3 organizations. And so it's rare that you have one party who controls so much power that they could create revolutionary change. It's all was structured to kind of allow evolution, not revolution, right? Or focus on the few. So what you see always is kind of diffuse activity, right? Based on everybody's got to get their little piece. And otherwise nothing gets done. But I think there's inherently something structurally in how they created our government that impedes, some of the, I think, sanity and focus that we all would like to see. That's
Other thoughts or other topics?
Well, maybe we've gotten what we were supposed to get. I mean, the election that happened, it was, pretty split. Both sides, if you go back 2 or 3 years ago, we've been talking about this concept of everybody should agree on infrastructure. Here we are, we've got that. And we've gone through all these gyrations on these other things, but it sort of looks like none of it's going to get done. And, unless there's a big, maybe it all gets kicked down to 2022. They, throw all this stuff out there and you have an election in 2022 and, maybe that smorgasbord turns into one issue. You mentioned education, right? Maybe that's the issue, everybody's probably got their own views, so I'm not going to get into that, but, maybe you whittle this thing down to some things that people do agree on.
Well,
Or at least 51% of the people agree on, and the politicians finally, get badgered into the one thing that most people care about instead of 12 things that factions care about. Yeah, I mean, maybe it's working, it might be working better than we think, is what I'm saying, right? I mean, we don't like the media every day. It's not, and it's not bothering the market. I mean, what's your view on the market here and its response to all this, right? I mean, seems like it likes it, doesn't it?
Well, I think it's what the market's liking is that it's not going to be, the social infrastructure is not going to be 3 trillion or 3.5 trillion. I think they're like, it's maybe going to be 2 or less, but, and they like interest rates staying low, and, so there's a lot to like about the economy too, with all the noise. If you step back, there's, the innovation, the stuff that's going on is actually pretty impressive, and the earnings are through the roof. We just keep seeing corporate earnings going up, and, they're able to pass on prices because consumers are more flush with cash. And one of the interesting things that I saw a report out of, I think it was the San Francisco Fed, they looked at the income growth by demographic groups, and that what they're seeing is that the 1% and the top percents didn't grow as fast over the last couple of years as the bottom, in large part because of the government subsidies that were going on, but it's changing the makeup of how net worth is shifting. And I think that's a positive that you're seeing better growth from the lower end, which is going to help the economy. But it is a big issue. I think the other one that is in the back of people's minds right now and is getting more attention is the fact that we haven't addressed Social Security and Medicare, which we have a big deficit and we're running out of money for by 2030. And we're talking about creating new social programs and we can't figure out how to pay for the existing ones. So I think that's going to weigh on people and is going to get a lot more messaging coming up. Manchin's raised it. I think other people are going to be raising that. And then Vlad, you just threw something in the mix. So do you want to raise that one publicly? Because I think it's an interesting topic.
No, it's not just POTUS, no matter what party you're in, it's Congress too, and term limits, should absolutely be in the mix, because in some parts of the country, especially with gerrymandering and everything else, they're so out of touch with reality and they think they're Teflon, nothing sticks. And unfortunately.
Exactly.
There's another element that's going on, and this is pandemic related, Sherry, that you had raised, that what you're seeing now is with all the people moving around, the maps are changing. So you're seeing parts of the maps in Texas changing from, Republican to more Democrat. In rural areas, you're starting to see some shifts, particularly, out on Long Island, some of the small towns out on Long Island where people left the city and moved out permanently. You get 500 people move, you can swing, cities and counties to in their voting numbers. And that's changing kind of the shape of the rural areas too, which I think was an important area for how this election was handled, that some of the losses for the Democrats in some of the key states were more suburban areas than suburban households that they won in the presidential election and are losing here. So I think you're seeing some shifts that are pandemic related, moving people around and changing the maps as well.
Yeah, Tennessee and Texas are going to be interesting in the next round.
Yep. And you're seeing it in small towns too that had, it didn't take much to shift the votes, and all of a sudden you can start to change counties that way, and that changes the maps as well. So it's going to be fascinating to see.
I have a quick one. I just did a quick little research on what Americans think about a two-party system, and it says in a Gallup poll, which I think is relatively accurate, 62% says a third party is needed. Only 33% is happy with the two major political parties, and they think that they're doing an adequate job, which is kind of a stunning number to me.
I think a lot of people are having a hard time believing that it's just a two-party system anymore, because the parties don't have the same identities that they used to. So while I guess on paper it's a two-party system, in reality it's really not.
Except
But
the
if
money
it's really
goes
not
to-
right now, then it's even worse, right? Because then you have to, because there's only one vote, right? It's only either black or white or yellow and orange, or what do you want to call it?
It depends where you live. Some places vote twice.
That's the Chicago way, right? Vlad?
The U.S. has tried three
But that was
parties
Philly.
numerous times. They've never been able to sustain that third party, at least not in recent history, right?
Yep.
They
Yeah,
tried.
I mean, I
Right.
think
That's
one
right.
of the first kind of in the mix, I think, wasn't it when Ross Perot ran?
Yeah.
I guess
Yeah.
would have probably been the most relevant, I guess, that jostled the numbers a little bit more. There was an actual, but he bankrolled most of his own.
Well, I don't know if you heard it, Trump allegedly, threatened to go third party here just recently, and the Republican Party said, well, we're not going to cover all your legal expenses from all your post presidency legal activity. And furthermore, that database that you're showing to all your contingents, you're not going to have access to that anymore either. So he said, okay, I'll come on board.
Well, that's the thing. It's money. Money's driving the whole thing. So
That's
maybe
right.
that's the area that we should be focused on.
And that's where in other countries, I think it's less of a monetary thing. And there's less of a, multi-billion-dollar outlay of capital when it comes to political parties.
But Eddie, in, like some of the other countries you said were kind of the two-party system is, I mean, do those countries tend to lean more socialist anyway? Or no?
Not necessarily.
Lauren?
All
Sorry,
right, so
I didn't see your hand up.
okay, you're talking about Chicago, right? Old joke from Chicago. 2 precinct captains are going through a cemetery, right? Getting, writing down names to put on the voter rolls, right? One guy says to his friend, hey, this tombstone here, I can't really read it. I can't really make it out, so I'm gonna forget that one. His friend says, no, you put that guy's name down. He deserves to vote like everybody else in here. Okay, so that's, yeah, we get razzed all the time. Chicago, where the dead vote early and often, right? We get razzed all the time for that. But you can almost anticipate the bomb that I'm getting ready to drop. Okay, I came in late on this discussion. Has anybody used the word white resentment yet? Has anybody used that term? If we're talking about what's driving the voting in the United States, especially if you talk about, what happened with this last election, has anybody used that term yet? White resentment?
No.
Okay, well, I'm not going to elaborate now. Okay, you kind of probably know where I'm going with that. And especially in Virginia, that's what we saw. I mean, and it's not original for me, but basically, appeals, for instance, to parental choice in the schools, right? This is something really I'm even starting to alert a lot of the people in my community or, my circle about. There's an all-out attack on, school boards and this idea of the schools and what happens in the schools, and this idea of parental choice is a kind of a dog whistle that they're basically using as a way to, you could say, lead people down some of these, you could say, other types of like talking points. What I would like to point out to people, okay, whatever it is that they said about this past election, New Jersey re-elected a Democratic governor for the first time in 40 years, okay? For the first time in 40 years, you had a Democrat that got re-elected. Boston, which for all of its 200 years of existence has always had a white male as mayor, just elected an Asian female, okay? So I really don't think that it's easy or possible to really pigeonhole, talking about any kind of like trends. We clearly have two, you could say, populations, okay? For the most part, okay, the US electorate, and said it right, it's still about 73% white people. Whatever it is that you've heard about the diversity, the electorate is still about 73% white people. So the truth of it is, if all the white folks got on the same page, it wouldn't matter what the rest of us thought. That's the reality. That's the reality. Okay. What you have within this 73% literally is about the half of them, roughly about 30% of this electorate that lives in places where there are no non-white people. Okay, if you were to look at the electoral map from, any of the presidential elections, right, and you didn't know anything about the geography of the United States, you would assume that the country was mostly Republican. Vast swatches of red in the middle of the country and the, middle Western states like Idaho. However, these are places basically where there not that many people live, okay? If you look at the trends, and I've studied this, if you look back at electoral maps going back literally the last 20, 30 years, what you find is that white men who do not live in an urban area and some of their wives will vote for the Republican nominee. I don't care who he is, right?
Is that bad?
Mitt Romney carried the white vote. Barack Obama lost the white vote both times. Okay. So the thing of it is you have a good 30–40% of the American electorate that has no lived-in experience with non-white people. Okay. Therefore, they are susceptible to whatever kind of dog whistle these folks want to put out. And for the most part, it is portrayed as, you could say, a problem of the others living in the urban area. So for the most part, who the Republican candidates usually are for national and statewide offices, governor, Congress level, are basically these guys that are going to, quote, protect their voters from this danger or this horde or whatever it is that you're calling that emanate from the cities. Okay. And unless you start to talk about race, unless you start to factor race into this discussion, you're not going to really come up with any really, you could say, effective way to really kind of look at it. I don't really know where we go from here with that, to be honest with you. Okay. What you do have is maybe eventually times will just change on their own. The latest census showed that the under 18 population, now white people are definitely, you could say it's a majority for people under 18. So in one way, if I live long enough, some of this problem, so to speak, will just kind of like work itself out, basically. Okay, that's all I got for now.
Thanks,
I could go on, but.
Well, we try not to get too political here. I was just framing what we think came out of the election. So some of the problems you're raising, Lauren, are far bigger than I think the 361 group by itself can handle today. So particularly since Mark's on vacation. If Mark was here, I'd have a different view of that. But with him on vacation, I don't think we can take on the race issues in the United States today.
The cat's
Well, but
away.
I mean, what I say though is that I do, and I'm not being facetious about it. I appreciate the 361 community just because there just is a lot more of a thoughtful conversation, right? And as I say, people, and I'm not being, once again, I'm not trying to butter folks up. People with some vision. Okay, so maybe we're not going to get to it on this call, but I got a feeling that this is a group. If there ever is a group, within the business community or among the investor class that would want to look at these kind of issues in a very thoughtful manner, I think 361 is the place for it. I really do.
It's not going to come from the government. We know that, right?
Right.
Lauren, I think one of the issues apart from race is also generational change. Yeah, there are so many variables right now that are coming to a head. Generations changing, the way we work changing, the way we look at race, the way we embrace, all of that is changing. Yeah. And in that, I'm not exactly sure if there's a connection, but Stephen, I have a question for you. In that, looking at the polls and statistics, I read somewhere, I think it was in The Economist, 72% of Americans are unhappy with the economy, and it's a leading concern. But yet, they're flush with cash. How do you explain that?
I think this goes back to the pandemic issue before. We're out of sorts with our daily lives right now. And I think that we have been for an extended period, and the fits and starts about trying to get past the pandemic have actually, not everyone's working in offices. People can't commute. Their jobs are changing, or they're going through a lot of change. People are retiring earlier. because they just don't want to deal with the health issues around the pandemic. So I think there's this is such a highly unusual time, and we're doing it at a period where things are moving really fast. From a technological change is very disorienting. The pandemic's disorienting. You have geopolitics that are really kind of unusual. And then you add to that the climate issues as well. And you get a kind of an unusual witch's brew, even though net worths are going up considerably. I think it's more fear about the unknown of the future than it is about the present, because, we're in a very healthy economy right now with pretty robust job growth and, with some inflation, but the inflation is being offset by increases in wages. So I think it's just the general disorientation that we've gone through the last 18 to 24 months.
Stability and uncertainty of the future job and livelihood.
And where we go, what do rising rates mean with housing? Is it in a bubble? Or are we going to, is everything going to be unaffordable forever? How do you deal with that? So I think it's the uncertainty that's coming. And I also think it's a lack of confidence in leadership that doesn't give you, you're not inspired for confidence when, you're talking about $6 trillion or $3 trillion or $2 trillion. There's a lot of things moving around. So I think it's hard to have the confidence that you might have had in a more stable period. We just don't have that right now. And ironically, the economy is doing exceptionally well. The US is probably the strongest economy in the world right now, other than some emerging market economies that have been on the right side of things right now. But generally, the US is doing well. China's slowing down, but partially planned with their slowdown. Europe is on the rise, but you're seeing there's some challenges all over, particularly on an energy side in Europe. So, you would think that people in the US and in North America in general, Canada's doing pretty well too, should feel better than they do. Why they don't is probably, I think, a leadership issue. And I don't mean that to be a Democratic one. I mean that this goes back for several years now. I think our politicians have failed pretty significantly. So I think that's part of the challenge.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting. The latest poll that came out, Biden's approval rating is in the toilet, right?
Yep.
And the number one reason that the people who don't approve of him give for, why they say that about him is they say he's not focused on what's important. Then they ask people, well, what do you think is the most important thing? The economy. So whatever, like you said, the perception is that the leaders are not doing what they're supposed to be doing. And I guess even if they did start doing it, people maybe wouldn't notice. It would take them a long time to notice, right? They're kind of hardwired into this idea that the leaders don't know what they're doing and they're not focused on the right thing.
But if you go back and look at, and this goes back to what we said earlier, when there's a targeted message that what the government's playing for, you can evaluate them on that. When it's so diffused, you can't tell whether they're going to be successful or not. And with the amount of money that's being talked about being thrown around, I don't think people have any confidence that they can deliver. And I think that's really what's impacting economic confidence right now. Because they're
real talk. Do you think people really care if it's 2 trillion or 3 trillion? Really?
Yeah.
Do you think people
Yes.
really care about that?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yes, they do.
Because it has to be paid for by them and their labors. And if you think that you're giving a third of your paycheck or half your paycheck to the government every time, and they want to increase the spending when they have programs like Social Security and Medicare that are critical to so many people, then yeah, they really do care about the couple trillion.
And those are going bankrupt.
And those are, we can't afford the benefits. We've already committed to them, but we're going to give them more benefits that we can't afford. I think that's what people are reacting to. And I think it's a real issue.
So what you're saying, they're reacting to that, basically, they think that they're going to have to pay out too much and be committed to stuff that they won't be able to pay for in the future.
They're not going to get what they want, what they've been promised, and they're going to have a bigger tax bill for it at the end. I think that is what's weighing on people's minds right now. And if you want to have a confident economy, you have to be confident in the guys that are helping drive it. And I'm not sure that you're getting that from either side in Washington, D.C. I think Powell's done the best he can to do it. I think that I think the president is trying to do it, but I think he's working with a very fractured party that he should have capitalized maybe a little bit more on the strength he had right coming out of the election, and tried to bring people in line towards a more narrow agenda that would have been better able to get put
They
through.
say Obama, and it's interesting, they say Obama made the exact same mistake.
Yep. This is
Well,
there's
George-
a lot of analogies to the 09-010 midterms, so it'll be interesting to see. But Lauren,
Bush
you went
made
on
the
what I
same
started,
error.
but I started with, I wouldn't read too much into this because the incumbent party usually gets slaughtered in the midterms anyway. But I do think there are some real issues, and I think the issues are a little different. It is the economy, and it is education is a real issue.
Yeah, but you do feel that discontent a lot more than any of these other previous kind of midterm periods, I think.
No.
And I'm not
You
sure
don't-
that's
you
the
don't think
case.
so?
I'm not sure that's the case, but Richard, you were going to say something. I'm sorry.
I was going to say Bush made the same error, right? You had interest rates that were low, and rather than refinancing, right? If you have a house, and we have the same thing going on, right? People are barely able to keep their mortgage, then all of a sudden they get a pay raise and interest rates are down. So rather than paying down their house quicker, they buy a bigger house. And that's the same thing that Bush did. Rather than restructuring the debt and paying it down quicker at a lower rate, we borrowed more money. And now the same thing's happening. The economy's doing great. So rather than paying things down and taking money and pushing it towards care and CAID and Social Security, we're spending more, and we're spending 80% of it, 85% of it on things that won't give a return, at least for 20 or 30 years. 110 billion or whatever is infrastructure. The rest will be sunk to pay off whatever and special interest and have some vassal effects, but it won't really have any benefit, and it certainly won't help service the long-term obligations that we have from care, CAID, and Social Security. That's the biggest issue, I think, for us. And just as a quick summary of thoughts, we say that, well, people, it's education, it's whatever. I think it's a bigger picture. So coming from people that are in the middle, I think it's that there's a group of people that think the government can solve everything. And there's a group of people that think the government needs to get out of the way and offer equal opportunity and quit seeking equal outcomes. You can't get equal outcomes, but you can certainly give equal opportunity. And so people where the government is trying to dictate everything, we just want the government to get out of their lives and make the opportunity to handle everything, handle those most critical things. And in many ways, the pandemic is one of those core things. The security of the country is the number one responsibility of the government, and health security is certainly just like defense, right? So I can certainly see that, and there's arguments in the middle, but I think it's people having the right to do what they need to do. And we could talk at another time about where, in many ways, the economics and I work in developing markets predominantly, but I also work with USDA and FEMA and all that sort of thing. And those areas where the government has the largest influence are the ones where the people have the least opportunity. And that's consistent around the globe. And so if we can find ways to open up opportunity, to me, that's the solution. And I think most everyone agrees that they want to increase opportunity. But.
Well, I mean, I would love to have an exchange with you on that. I know Stephen and I have talked about this idea of equality of opportunity as opposed to equality of outcome, right? And once again, I'm coming, from let's say a group of people who, couldn't rely on that. One thing that I've heard, or one term that I've heard, is that, until very recently, from, most guys in my community, the government was actually the mentor. A lot of the things that people would go or rely on, you could say, the mentorship process to do, we didn't have access to that. So in a lot of ways, we are probably even more oriented toward this idea of, you could say, looking to the government to solve things, because traditionally we haven't been able to get, the support or the leverage any other way. So like I said, the way I've heard it is that in a lot of instances, the government winds up being our mentor, right?
Well, yeah, I'm not sure the government is ever a mentor. They're a check writer, but I'm not sure a government could ever be a mentor because it's people. I think people could be a mentor, but the institution of government where it comes in and provides support and services in a way that you become reliant on those is something that in history we've called economic slavery, right? If I can get you to depend on certain things and you're happy to take that check, or you're happy to live in this place, or you're happy to do whatever, I can keep you from having other opportunity. So by getting you to
Put it this way,
sacrifice
all
your
of the-
future for today,
And like I said, we
I can
got all of
control
the
you.
opportunity in the world. Put it this way, I can get all the education in the world, but if basically people are not comfortable with working with folks like me, it's not going to matter. And, you know, and all of us have our anecdotal stories that we can say, you know, talk about. And really, times are quote changing a bit, but I mean, yeah, we for every, you could say, example or something like that you would give, I can give you another one that basically shows, yeah, but the system is sort of hardwired to resist any of that. I can get all the education that
Lauren,
I want.
Lauren, it's interesting though, but the survey from Gallup says people want less involvement of government in their lives. That's the majority of people want less involvement with government, not more.
And let me tell you, like I said, the thing of it is, even most of the people you could say within my universe, we're always talking about, okay, well, what is the alternative to, you know, quote, government? You know, it's kind of interesting, you could say in that way, that what you would perceive as the, you could say, typical point of view of, and I'm not really into this whole kind of like left-right dichotomy thing anyway, right? But trust me, believe you me, here on the South Side, that's the one thing people are talking about, is how can we do this thing without having to run to the alderman, you know, and a lot of time, or, you know, run down to City Hall. A lot of times when we try to do stuff around here now, the alderman is like the last person that gets called.
Mhm.
Do you know what I mean? And
Because you
so
don't want
it's
to pay the
interesting.
big.
So Richard, how would I say it? The old format of thinking that, quote, government is the way to kind of affect all of these changes that we're trying to make, that is outdated. But you could say what would I call it? The red line is still the same. The red line is still the same. Whatever it is that we're talking about in terms of, you know, greater equity, inclusion, et cetera, it's just, I would acknowledge that, yeah, we're trying to look at, okay, and you know why? And it's not even so much the economic slavery thing, it's this idea of sustainability, right? It's not sustainable. If it only comes from the government, it's not going to be sustainable, because it's going to always blow with the wind, you know, and you're always going to have to go back and, you know, request another allocation, another, you know, and that's not going to work. So what we're talking about doing is, how do you build something that's sustainable?
Which is why the educational issue is so important. And it's why that it was important in this election as to what was said about parents shouldn't be involved, because you don't want to abdicate the responsibility for educating your kids solely to the government. That would be a mistake. So
No,
you
but
actually
the dog whistle about parents' choice has nothing to do with kind of like the curriculum. Like I said, it's a dog whistle that is.
No,
talking about parents'
Lauren,
choice.
I think you're missing the point. I think what was the election issue was schools being closed and kids not being able to go and parents not being able to work. That's a big part of what was the issue in New Jersey, and it was a big part of the issue in Virginia. It wasn't just.
I don't know. I'm gonna do a little bit more research. We're gonna compare
Go right
notes
ahead.
on that one.
I have a question.
I'm just giving- ahead,
Addressing
No,
a point.
CRT, critical race theory, right?
Greg, go ahead.
Gregory,
So
go on.
addressing a point that Adam made regarding the economy and so to you, Stephen. So the numbers we look at they're aggregate in general,
Yeah.
right? And those aggregate numbers make us make a decision on whether the economy is doing well or not. I read an interesting article today in Bloomberg saying how JP Morgan's think tank has been providing the government with granular data in terms of what people did with the cash that was given to them during the pandemic, or the cash they saved because there was nowhere to go spend it.
Yep.
which is resulting in, I think good things and bad things. One is a better understanding of what's happening on a more granular basis, but also JP Morgan gets to promote policies based on this. So I'm not sure whether it's good or bad, but so the question is this, and let's go back to the Fed, for example, one brief second. We don't know what the unemployment rate is anymore. We have a number,
Right.
but the problem is we've now realized that number, that's an aggregate number, and that's not telling us enough about what's happening in cohorts.
Yep.
Now, could it be that those, it's a wealth issue, it's a wealth distribution problem that is basically telling us everything's gung ho at the aggregate level, but in the weeds, things are really not that great, and it's not being addressed.
I saw a different number from the San Francisco Fed that said that what's happened over the last 2 years has actually helped the lower income people more significantly than maybe at any point in time because of the subsidies that were provided. But
I don't dispute that at all. It's probably right. Question is, was it enough?
Right, exactly. You've had 30 years. You've had 30 years of it going up to the top, right? You had 30 years where real incomes for the bottom 90% literally haven't changed in 30 years, right?
I think Gregory also, and Stephen, Lauren, it's not only was it enough, okay, you have cash, but a big part of it is also, what do I do tomorrow? What do I do in 5 years? What do I do in 10 years? Where particularly the older generation, and you have the younger generation coming up, taking power, and that's creating a lot of conflict. But in terms of the stimulus and what's next, yeah, you're richer, but everything else is more expensive. And I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. I don't know what's going to happen in 5 years. And
you've all pointed it out. We've all been shell shocked by the pandemic, so it's almost like not logical to think about what's going to happen in 5 years, right? I mean, that's how a lot of people would tend to think. Why would I make a plan about 10 years from now? We see what's happened this last 2 years,
Well, you don't even have to go 5 years or 10 years, just 2 years, because things are moving so quickly, very fast.
Yeah, listen, I agree with that, Adam. I think the economy's changing very fast. I think the opportunities are actually growing as fast as the economy's changing.
Oh, without
and I think that's the part that's not being captured. And I think that's what Richard was pointing out. This gets to, are you offering opportunity or offering equality and of outcomes? And I think, what was done was to carry people through, not to solve every problem that we had, but to deal with the health problem that would allow us to get to the other side. It wasn't to cure every ill that's ever happened in history in our country. And I think that's part of what is getting messed up in the discussions here is it was a pandemic relief efforts, not solving every problem since the creation of our country.
No, but what those people did do is what they kind of were saying is that, hey, look, the way things are is kind of how we got here. That's kind of one of the expressions that I use to folks when the pandemic, in the early part of the pandemic, people were talking about things going back to normal. And I would say, hey, maybe normal is how we got here in the first place. So I think a lot of people, especially if you're talking about on the real progressive side, so to speak, and like I said, I don't like this left-right kind of dichotomy, but what they kind of saw was, okay, especially I think the ones that recognize that there was this, like say, flood of liquidity out there, they're looking at it as an opportunity.
That's the Rahm Emanuel, right?
This is our opportunity to make some of these really substantial fundamental changes, right?
Right,
and let's not forget George Floyd.
But Lauren, you're mixing all these other issues with trying to take everything that's ever happened to make it, we can get one outcome. And that is, I think, the absolute wrong way to go about it.
Well, like I said, I know you, I'm a little bit atypical from whatever it is that you would perceive, someone on that side of the spectrum would be. I'm not looking for, I see that it is a bit nuanced, but like I said, I mean, you know, like I said, I'm just coming from, let's say I'm coming from an orientation that's really challenging more, you could say some of the more like fundamental.
Yeah, but
you know,
but
some of the more
that's actually the
fundamental
problem
factors,
though.
right?
Lauren, I think that's the problem because the policies aren't dealing, you can't deal with everything that's ever happened in our country in a 2-year period because a group got elected that they can't agree on anything for. You actually have to isolate the issues and find a way to solve those issues in an isolated fashion. You can't solve every problem we have in one shot and just throw money at it and expect you're going to get a good outcome. And we're not going
I
to.
agree you can't, I agree you can't throw money at it, but I'm not sure, I'm not so sure that I'll sit with you on this idea that you can't solve it all at once. In fact, that's even a term that we use. We call it a whole system solution.
I understand what your desired outcome is, but you're already saying we don't have enough, we're not getting enough to the people that need it. So you can't solve it that way. That's my only point. There's not enough money to solve 200 and some odd years of history. Right. So you actually have to deal with it differently. So that's the only takeaway that I have. I think it's going to be, I think what the government's going to be stuck with is they have much bigger bills than they have the ability to afford. And then you think people have a problem now that are disadvantaged. Wait till that happens, because then the disadvantage will get even greater. So,
well, it's just that we don't have to keep doing the same thing over and over again in the same way. That's the thing.
Nobody's
So, like I said,
disputing that though.
I mean, yeah, like I said, you seem to presuppose that the only thing that, you know, people from that side of the spectrum want is kind of like a, you know, 21st century version of the New Deal, right? That's why I hated that expression Green New Deal, right? I was just like, oh God.
Actually, that's unfair that you said I presuppose that, because it's not the case. I'm just saying you can't do everything at once, because there's real math, and it's simple math that our country is on an unsustainable course if we try and do everything that's being asked to be done. And then what do you have? Then you just have more people.
Well,
then
maybe
you
you
have
have
more people
guys like
miserable.
me and you have guys like me and Adam who are, you know, advocating decentralized finance. You know, you're having folks that are
Yeah, but you don't. That's going to
advocating-
happen whether you promote that or not.
That's gonna
That
happen.
train's leaving the station.
And
So
the irony of it is the people that you're talking about voting for are the ones that are going to keep that from happening, because they'll lose control. And it's all about control and power. And the definition that we always say is the definition of insanity is doing the same thing and looking for different results. Yet we elect the same party and the same people to do the same thing in the worst cities in the country. And they have the highest crime rate, the highest unemployment rate, and the highest infection rates consistently on everything, not just on COVID, and all of the other ills that come to society. And those same parties are still being elected by the same people, and they don't understand why they get the same results. So if you want to change things, you have to change the attitude and the position of those electorate. And we have to start demanding from them the things like we were saying, where you limit term limits, where you put 2 or 3 things in and say, these are my default.
To chop it up on that. I think that I'm 100%, 180% on the other side with you on the bit with the term limits.
I'm just using math.
But Lauren, even if back to what Richard just said, though, if you look at I'm pretty sure, I don't know the statistics, but I'm pretty sure the Democrats have run Chicago for quite some time, right?
Forever.
And Delaware and Massachusetts.
And they keep being reelected by the people that you're saying aren't being well served.
Well, I mean, thing is, we even
saying.
had to get rid of partisan elections in Chicago.
I know, but I'm just saying the party that you would think is most interested in serving those needs hasn't delivered forever.
Well, I mean, how do you say it? Once again, don't know how far in the weeds that you kind of like want to get with that, and it's actually also difficult. Once again, that's why I say I'm not into the left-right spectrum.
But I'm just saying the party that you guys keep electing isn't delivering. That's not left or right. That's your elected officials aren't delivering for you. That's where the problem starts.
And Lauren, I would argue that it is a left-right issue, because you have a party that's slowly moving to the far left, to a communist movement, and you're now in a socialist position. And it sounds funny, Adam, but it's
I would
it's-
say the exact
No,
I
opposite.
spend
You gotta-
80% of my year
No,
in
I-
socialist
I-
countries,
I-
and we are very much approximating that.
Richard, I take issue with that. I take big issue with
I
that.
say it's the
What,
exact
that
opposite.
we're becoming
You
a
have
socialist
Republican
country?
Party that's moving
I
toward
live
fascism.
like
You know, we don't want to get
Richard,
in that.
I've worked
Hold
in
on.
developing countries. I've lived in very, how can you say, questionable environments. Tajikistan, Azerbaijan, Russia, okay? Turkmenistan.
Mhm.
I know what dictatorship looks like. I know what socialism looks like. My family came from.
So you can see that those components are now being adopted into our own practice.
No, I do not. I do not see those components here. What I see here is change based on technology, based on generations, new generation coming in, technology displacing people. What are you going to do with these unemployed truckers once electric trucks start roaming the highways? You have to do something.
They're already looking for jobs.
I'm capitalist. Capitalism needs to change as well.
Oh,
to
absolutely,
cater to
absolutely.
people.
But it doesn't mean you replace it with government.
And,
But
and I
yeah.
do.
Right now, we're replacing it with government, but you're exactly right. We have to adopt like an industrial revolution.
Like I said, how do you see, once again, and I think some of that is with perspective, I would say completely the opposite. It's not only is it not being replaced with government, but you could say moneyed interests are even becoming more entrenched in terms of their control on the system. You know, and like I said, you know, I'll have to go out and how you said, this is something that I don't even necessarily bring inside the 361 space a lot. I think what you really have also too, Adam, is a generation that basically is just tired of that capital has the ultimate prerogative. And they're looking for other alternatives. Right now, the only format that we have to work with is, quote, through government, right? But this is the whole thing. In a democratic society, the government is the only institution that will speak for the people. And any other institution that you're talking about is going to look after their own vested interests. Now, that's not saying that government hasn't, deteriorated into, an institution that's looking after its own interests. But Richard, I would argue that at least in theory, in a democratic system, the government is the only institution that can speak for the people, because the business, corporations by law have to deal with shareholder value or have to look after the interests of their shareholders.
If you go back,
I think that we can come together.
How you
Warren, I
can
was
system.
very careful with that statement, particularly Russia, for example, where I lived for a good 20 years, Russia and Central Asia. The government does not speak for the people.
No, that's what I said. I understand that the way that it plays out in reality might be, but I'm just saying is that I am not looking at corporations to speak for my interest. And quite honestly, I wouldn't expect them to.
But Adam's exactly right. Russia says it speaks for the people, though, right? If you ask the government in Russia, they say they speak for the people. But many of the Russians, if you talk to them quietly, say,
that's what I'm saying.
that's
I'm
not the
grown.
case.
And just
They're
because
doing
they
what the
say that, I'm
government's
grown. Just because they say that doesn't mean I have to accept that. Hell, are you
Right,
kidding me?
right.
I would never.
No,
I would never want a Soviet system. Never, ever, ever, never.
Well, I think we can all agree on most of those things. It's kind of how you get there. And what you're talking about trying to accomplish, Lauren, I think the way what everyone wants to do is get to the same point. I think we want equal opportunity for everyone, equal opportunity for education, equal opportunity for employment, for technology, for training. I think everyone really, really wants that. If you took a poll on that, I would say 90% of Americans would agree that they want everyone to have that kind of opportunity, and we don't. And we have to find ways.
And that's why I say, that's why I appreciate 361, because this is one of the few places that we can talk about stuff like this and, strongly disagree on stuff, but we're still getting somewhere in terms of, at least I am getting somewhere in terms of my understanding. That's why I appreciate this space. the
Well,
way
thank
that-
you guys for today, but I have to get somewhere now too. I'm sure you guys do as well.
Thank
So,
you. I
Thanks,
appreciate the
thanks for
interaction.
joining and thanks for participating. Thanks, Anessa.
Thanks
Jack,
much.
take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye, guys.